All right, so welcome to our September 2022 Lunch and Learn training focused on working with residential treatment centers, known as RTCs, another acronym. So I'm going to turn it over to Molly Shaw, and she is our fantastic presenter today. Some of you may have had a chance to work with Molly, as she is a deputy child advocate with the state, and she's been here since 2006, I think, quite a while. So Molly, welcome, and thank you so much. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lauren. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, as Lauren stated, I am a deputy child advocate with OCA. I work statewide. I do recognize some of your names, and I have worked at OCA since 2006. I've been a deputy since 2014. Prior to that, I was the office manager here, so long time with OCA. And throughout my career as a deputy, I have represented a lot of teen girls, which is why I know so much about RTCs, because it seems that teenage girls sooner or later tend to end up in RTCs at some point. As Lauren mentioned, I will be using the acronym RTC, which stands for Residential Treatment Center. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay. Oops, sorry, phone on mute. Okay, so if I can figure out how to advance my slides, there we go. Just a brief overview of today's topic. We'll go through briefly what is an RTC for those of you who may not be as familiar. We'll talk a little bit about how to work with RTCs and how to navigate those when you have a youth particularly placed out of state. And then we'll have a time at the end for discussion, any questions that weren't addressed during the presentation. Whoops, sorry. Okay, so to start off, we'll talk about what is an RTC. So it is a residential treatment center. It is usually a placement by the Division of Prevention and Behavioral Health. So it's generally speaking, most of the time, it is a mental health treatment placement, not a foster placement. Typically, you may see a youth end up needing an RTC placement if they have frequent ongoing behavior problems that are interfering with their placements, if they're, having a lot of foster placements that are disrupting. Often these may be spilling over also into school and affecting their education. And unfortunately, it can also these youth tend to have frequent interaction with the juvenile justice system. So when you have kind of all of that stuff going on, so first we want to make sure that we have exhausted mental health supports in the community. So hopefully if you have youth that are having some of these types of issues, they have an outpatient therapist at least at first, and then perhaps you've tried mobile therapy in the community, ETSF, therapeutic support for families, and you've tried these things to wrap some services and supports around the youth, and still it just seems that for whatever reason, they just can't get their behaviors together. And I talk about behaviors, but we all know that a lot of the behaviors that we see from our youth stem from trauma that they have experienced. So, the thought being that they need to process their trauma or whatever other kind of mental health issues they have going on in order to be able to cope and regulate their behavior a little bit better. So that's when we might, there might be a decision that there needs to be a higher level of care for residential, such as residential placement. When I say that it's a PBH placement, that means that the Division of Prevention and Behavioral Health is paying for the placement, paying for the treatment at the RTC. DFS is generally not paying for it. And therefore it's not considered a foster placement. Okay, it's a short-term, it's meant to be a short-term stay, to kind of stabilize the youth and give them an opportunity to work on and process whatever mental health issues they have going on without kind of having to worry about all the other day-to-day kinds of things that they may have to think about if they're in the community. Want to talk briefly about the difference between an RTC and some other types of placements you may be familiar with, such as group homes. So we have a few group homes in the state, Seaford House, People's Place Girls Group Home, Murphy School. We have the Terry Shelter, which is a temporary group placement. Those are foster placements, right? Those are not the same thing as a residential treatment. They may or may not be long-term, but they can be long-term. They may or may not offer therapeutic services on site. You know, Seaford House does have some therapeutic services that they offer, but those are DFS placements, foster placements for the youth, and those are different. You also may have worked with some youth that have been like hospitalized in an inpatient psychiatric facility for brief periods of time, such as Rockford, Meadowwood, Dover Behavioral Health, places like that. Those are also different from an RTC. Those types of inpatient facilities are generally meant to be a very short-term intervention when there's an immediate, safety risk or crisis, to help stabilize the youth and then get them back to a less restrictive setting for their ongoing services. Sometimes they can end up staying in those facilities for a longer amount of time, but it's not the same type of setting as a residential treatment center. One other thing that I want to note is that, I say usually it is a PBH placement and that it is a mental health placement, not a foster placement. But there are times, unfortunately, when it can become or even start out as a foster placement. So a lot of times, again, going back to the teen girls, if you've got sort of a difficult youth that is difficult to place because of their behaviors and a history of disrupted placements, and DFS can't find a foster home or group home willing to take them, sometimes those youth will end up, the only one I know of and that I've experienced is Kids Peace. They have what's called the diagnostic unit. And it is a sort of a temporary, like a 30-day stay in their diagnostic unit where they sort of determine whether this youth actually does need this higher level of care of a residential treatment center. And it's sort of a crisis intervention too. They'll sort of wrap some services around the youth and try to get them stabilized to see if they can go back out into the community. That generally is DFS, kind of placing the youth there, usually because they're out of options otherwise. Also, it can become a DFS placement if the youth has successfully completed their treatment at an RTC and is ready for discharge. But DFS has not found a placement for them. And so if the Division of Prevention and Behavioral Health, PBH, has determined that the youth no longer needs this level of treatment, they will stop paying for placement at the RTC. And if DFS has nowhere else to put that youth, then DFS will start paying for the placement until a placement, a more appropriate placement can be found. And the youth will continue to receive services during that time from the RTC. So as I mentioned, RTCs, the goal is that they be short-term. Usually about 90 days is the target. In my experience, youth generally stay there longer than that. I would say maybe 6 months seems to be an average length of stay at least. But some youth, do complete the program in a shorter amount of time. But again, it's meant to be temporary, not a long-term placement. Generally, at every residential treatment center, youth will receive both individual and group therapy. They'll have typically individual sessions with their assigned therapist at least once or twice a week, and then groups throughout the week. And the groups might address, all kinds of various topics, coping skills. For the girls, they have a lot, about like dating violence or, trafficking, all sorts of topics can be discussed during those group sessions. And one thing to just keep in mind, this is not something typically that you would need to worry about, but just something to be aware of perhaps, is that youth who are 14 or older often need to consent to go to an RTC. I've never really seen this be an issue. I did have one client one time who was refusing to consent, and she was supposed to go to an RTC in the state of Virginia. And Virginia said that if she did not consent, she could not go to the RTC, that she could not be court ordered there, that according to their laws, you have to consent, they cannot be court ordered to attend RTC treatment. She ended up consenting, so it wasn't an issue. I don't know what would have happened if she had not. I suppose we would have had to find a different placement for her. But so just, again, something to kind of be aware of if you do have, work with a youth who needs to go to an RTC and they don't want to consent, they may be worried about going there, or they don't know what to expect. You may be called upon to talk with the youth to try to talk through what they're worried about and see if you can help obtain their consent. But I don't think that happens very often, at least in my experience. So I just wanted to mention a few of the commonly used RTCs that we use for our youth in DFS custody. Kids Peace is a big one. They are in Pennsylvania, about 2 hours away, which is not a bad distance. It's nice when kids are placed there because it's fairly easy to get up there and visit them. And I've had pretty good experiences with Kids Peace. I would say it's a pretty good, pretty typical RTC. I put Devereaux on here because for years and years, the department used Devereaux, but I believe they are not using Devereaux anymore. But I just wanted to mention it in case they start using them again in the future, so you would be familiar with the name. George Jr. is also in Pennsylvania. It is only for boys. I have never had a youth there. I don't have any direct experience, but I have heard wonderful things about George Jr. So if you have a male youth that you work with and they need RTC placement, you could ask, is George Jr. an option? I think youth that have either been adjudicated or have some juvenile justice issues may tend to go there, but I'm not positive if it's only for youth with juvenile justice issues or not. DTA, diversified treatment alternatives, also in Pennsylvania, is a good RTC for youth with sexually inappropriate behaviors. So we've had some good outcomes with youth that have been there. I recently had a youth at the Hughes Center in Virginia, and it was the first time that I have interacted with them, and I loved it. I thought they were fabulous. They specifically work with youth with intellectual disabilities or on the autism spectrum disorder. And they were fantastic to work with in terms of just communication and working with my client and advocating for her. So I really liked that one. Newport News is another one where I recently had a youth, also in Virginia. She was only there a pretty short time. She didn't really need that level of care, I don't think, and they didn't think so either. So she was not there very long, but in the time she was there, I found them easy to work with and communicate with. So that was pretty good. There are a variety of RTCs popping up that are specific to youth who have been commercially or sexually exploited or trafficked. One of those that I know we've been using a little more frequently is Youth for Tomorrow in Virginia. There are some others. I know that there's one in Florida that I had a client at one time, but just something to be aware of if you do have a youth that has been a victim of trafficking. There are some specialized RTCs to help those youth process and work through the trauma that they endured with that experience. Coastal Harbor in Georgia is one that's used a lot. I don't have any direct experience with that. I think it's sort of, it's maybe not the best, but probably not the worst. And then Mill Creek in Arkansas is one that is sometimes used. I feel like maybe when when DFS has exhausted all of their options, and it is not great. So if you ever hear that DFS is considering sending your youth to Mill Creek, I would try to advocate to the extent that you can that DFS try to find an alternative. We do have one RTC in Delaware, that is Silver Lake. It may be called Middletown RTC or Odessa House. There are a couple different pieces to it that I'm not really sure how they all interact because I've never had a youth there. We're not really going to talk too much about that because if you've got a youth in Delaware and an RTC, it's a lot easier to get information and see your client and all of that. So it's not as relevant to this presentation, but just to be aware that we do have that one. It is run by Delaware's Division of Prevention and Behavioral Health. So moving on to communication, which is really one of the biggest, concerns and issues when you've got a youth placed out of state at an RTC. So there are a couple ways that you can try to make this a little bit easier. The first is that DFS has to fill out a whole lot of paperwork when they send a youth to an RTC. And some of that paperwork, asks for like team members or other important people that work with the youth, or even youth, or even people that are approved to have contact with the youth, or that the youth, can make phone contact with. So just asking DFS to include you in that paperwork can be very helpful, so that, it's not that we need to be, specifically included in that paperwork because of, our court appointments, but it just makes life a lot easier if your name and contact information has already been provided to the RTC, because a lot of times they'll use that paperwork when they send out incident reports or treatment plans. They'll just include everyone that's listed on that. So you can ask the worker as they're filling out that paperwork to include you as a contact. The most important thing, and I cannot stress this enough, is once the youth is established at the RTC, find out the name and contact information of their assigned therapist or a case manager if depending on the RTC and how they designate their staff. But the youth should usually be assigned a therapist, and that person will be your lifeline, your best friend in trying to make sure that you keep up with what's going on with the youth there. DFS should, in theory, have that information. The PBH worker should hopefully have that information. Now, some RTCs are really hard to get information from. I mean, no matter how hard you try or DFS tries. So I did have one of the RTCs in Virginia, either the Houston or the Newport News, when my client went there, it did take us a little while, me and the DFS worker, to figure out a contact there. But once we did, like I said, communication was very easy after that. But you may have to do a little digging to get to that information. But if you can find out the therapist, that's going to be super helpful going forward. The youth should get a treatment plan as soon as they are placed at the RTC, and the therapist is assigned and can figure out, what the youth's needs are. And, then they're going to come up with treatment goals and how the youth is going to reach those goals. In my experience, in the good RTCs, those treatment plans are updated monthly. And typically there will be a monthly treatment team meeting. So those meetings generally consist of the therapist, somebody from nursing or a psychiatrist, somebody from the education division of the RTC, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then it should be, extended to DFS, PBH, the CASA, the child attorney, if they're involved at that level, parents, if they're involved still in the child's life. So it's a great time to get updates on how the youth is doing in all aspects of treatment and education and just general health and well-being. Typically they're done by phone. They're like anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. They're pretty brief, but it's still a very helpful way to just keep tabs on what is going on. And then after those meetings, the treatment plan will be updated to reflect, what was discussed in that meeting. And then it's generally sent out, hopefully to DFS and PBH if you've got a good relationship with the therapist, they will often include you on that too. And I'll usually ask at the team meeting, especially in the beginning, you know, can you please send me the updated treatment plan when you send that out, and provide my email address if they don't have that already.
Molly, can we ask a question?
Yep.
What is the Terry shelter?
Oh, okay. Sorry, I did mention that and then did not explain it. The Terry shelter is it's a temporary like emergency placement here in Delaware. So it's congregate care living. So it's you know, a house where multiple youth can be placed at the same time, girls and boys. And it's called a shelter because it's basically, you know, what it is. It's meant to be a short-term emergency placement. Maybe when a youth first enters care, if DFS hasn't been able to identify a foster home yet, or, you know, a youth has sorry, sort of I'm looking for, has blown through their placement, you know, and DFS hasn't yet identified a new placement, then they might go to the Terry shelter for a brief period of time. It's located in Newcastle County. And yeah, it's just, and it's, you know, housed, I mean, it's staffed. Sorry, one thing I forgot to mention on the previous slide is that RTCs are what we call staff secure. So they're not as secure as like detention, right? Where the youth at night are typically locked into, you know, a pod or a room or whatever. At RTCs, they're called staff secure, which means there's 24-hour staff. You know, there are staff there all night to kind of keep an eye on things. Generally, like the main doors might be, you know, locked or controlled only by the staff, but the youth are not, you know, not confined to their rooms or things like that. So it is possible for youth to run from RTCs, and it has happened before. So Terry shelter is basically the same, you know, so it is staffed 24/7, just like any of the other group homes. It's just meant to be more temporary, not meant to be a long-term foster placement for youth.
Gotcha. So the Terry shelter is kind of in line with Seaford House and Murphy School as congregate care rather than residential treatment centers.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
Thank you.
And not to be confused with the Terry Center, the Terry Children's Psychiatric Center, which we also have in Delaware, which is a psychiatric hospital for young children. So a lot of people get Terry Center and Terry Shelter confused as well. And also Terry Center is not an RTC, it's a psychiatric inpatient hospital, which again, it can be hard sometimes to distinguish between an RTC and a psychiatric hospital, but RTCs are generally meant to have a more kind of a nurturing, you know, somewhat home-like feel to them, as opposed to psychiatric hospitals that just are more like a hospital setting. So that's kind of one of the main ways to distinguish between the two. So yes, I hope that answers that question. So back to communication. Again, like I said, some RTCs are just really hard to communicate with. The one I mentioned, Mill Creek, I have heard from colleagues is that way, that it can be extremely hard to find out who a therapist is, whether the child even has an assigned therapist, you know, to get information out of them. Sometimes that's just going to be the case. And, you know, you just can keep trying. There are some ways you should be able to get some minimal amount of information. You know, my understanding is that these places are required to maintain communication with PBH when PBH is paying for the placement on a regular basis, so that, you know, PBH can continue to determine whether the youth needs that level of care. So they have what's called utilization review periodically. So if you can ask your PBH worker, you know, who they communicate with for those utilization reviews, then perhaps you can get a name and contact information and try to go from there. You know, sometimes DFS will get incident reports emailed to them. So if the youth was involved in like had to be restrained or taken to the hospital for some reason or anything like that, DFS should get notification of things like that. So you could again ask, you know, have you received any incident reports? If so, who did it come from? So if you can try to just get a name and number, hopefully from there you can use that to make contact with the youth and or their therapist. And, you know, as always, if you can't get anywhere and you're having issues, you can always reach out to your coordinator and the child attorney, you know, to try and come up with some other ways to get information. So maintaining contact with the youth while they're at an RTC, it can be tricky. Again, if you have been able to establish a relationship with the therapist, that is the easiest way, in my experience, to make sure that you can remain in contact with the youth. So you can, you know, I tend to email with the therapist and ask them either what is a good day and time that I can come and visit, you know, because I want to be mindful of their schedule and their therapy and all the things they have going on. Or, you know, if they're far away and I can't visit in person, or during COVID, a lot of the RTCs were locked down and nobody was allowed to come visit. Then I would ask them to help me set up phone calls or Zoom sessions with my client. You know, in person obviously is the best possible way. Zoom and phone are fine otherwise, but it can be hard to ensure privacy or confidentiality, because often the therapist will stay in the room, you know, with the youth if the youth is on their computer doing Zoom or something like that. So you can, you know, when you set up the meeting, you can either say, I need to make sure that, you know, nobody else is in the room, or when the youth gets on the phone or the Zoom, you can ask them, is there anybody else in the room with you? You know, if yes, do you feel comfortable asking them to step out? If not, or if there's somebody in the room, you know, just try to, if you want to ask your client questions about how they're doing, you know, just be mindful they may not be as honest as they might otherwise be if nobody else is in the room. And, you know, you can still, even if you can't have those deep confidential conversations with your client, it still just means the world to them to just check in, you know. So even if you're just calling and the therapist is in the room and you're just saying, hey, I want to see how you're doing, you know, how's it going? And just to maintain that contact is really important for the youth while they're, you know, placed out of state, away from everything they know. It really helps them to feel that they haven't been forgotten or just, you know, shoved away in a closet somewhere. And another important thing that you can do when you talk with the youth is ask if there's anything they need. Most places will provide basic toiletries for the youth, but these kids, you know, especially the girls, they usually have their preferred bath products, lotions, makeup, face products, you know, all of that stuff. And OCA is more than happy to help provide things like that for youth when they're placed out of state at RTCs. So you can just talk to your coordinator about making a funding request to send some things like that to the youth. If you're able to go visit in person, you know, we can get the items to you so you can bring a little care package to them. If they're far away, those things can be, you know, delivered directly through Amazon. Again, I'll typically ask the therapist for the best you know, address, or should I put it in care of the therapist or what? And other things too, not just bath products, but, you know, books, art supplies, whatever the youth are interested in is just a really great way to help them, again, feel that they haven't been forgotten, that somebody still cares about them, help them feel a little bit normal. So OCA can certainly, you know, help with all of that. Just one thing that I would note is to be sure to check with the therapist to make sure that they're not asking for something they're not allowed to have. So, you know, I have 2 client sisters that are into crochet. So I had to make sure that they were allowed to have like crochet needles or whatever it was that they wanted. But it ended up being fine, and they were able to get those supplies so they could do that. GIMP, they were both also really into GIMP and making bracelets. So that's a fun way for them to pass the time, I guess. You can also make sure that you ask about if they have an upcoming court hearing, if they want to participate in that court hearing. You know, it would obviously be most likely via Zoom unless they're really close by. If they do want to, then again, you can make arrangements with the therapist to make sure that the youth will be available. And usually you want the therapist to participate as well, and be there with the youth in case they hear anything that's upsetting to them, and they need someone to help support them through that. So you can make those arrangements as well. And again, if you're running into any issues, getting in touch with the youth, you can reach out to the coordinator and the child attorney. Some places, again, I know that Mill Creek is one of these, may try to say that during the first few weeks while the youth is getting settled or something like this, that they're not allowed to have contact with anybody outside the RTC, or it may be their contact may be limited as a punishment if they have broken the rules. These things are not okay. You should not accept that. If you're told that, you should push back on that. Say, that you're a worker for this youth. You need to be able to have access to them. And again, if you're hearing things like that, reach out to the coordinator and the attorney to help you address them if necessary. So family engagement can also be really important when youth are in residential treatment. If the parents are still involved in case planning or just involved as supports in the youth's life, then they should be encouraged to call, write, visit if appropriate. It is possible for youth to even have overnight or off-site visits. I had my youth that was at the Hughes Center. She was able to spend a weekend with her mother and grandmother for her birthday while she was there. So, that's something to consider and ask about as well. So if you have a good relationship with the parents or you're in contact with them, just encourage them to continue to maintain contact with the youth. A lot of treatment plans for youth will include family therapy when that's appropriate as well. So it may be by phone or Zoom, or if the family is close enough, they may drive up, once a week to engage in family therapy. But even if they don't have formal therapy, there should be, make sure that there is access, that the youth are able to contact their family. The Hughes Center, again, I just can't say enough good things about them, but they had designated family engagement as part of the treatment plan. So even though they weren't, family therapy was not appropriate or not part of the case plan for that family, they had a set time every week for a Zoom, with the mother and the grandmother, just to maintain that relationship, which was awesome. And then other relatives or support people, I will just mention, I mentioned earlier that DFS generally has to provide the RTC with a list of approved people that the youth can have, contact with, generally phone contact. So if there are other relatives, aunts, uncles, or whoever that are supports to the youth, I would encourage DFS to include those people on the call list, or other support people. So I have a client who doesn't have any family that's involved in her life, but she does have some supports that, people that she made relationships with while she was in the Terry Center. And those people I asked to be included on her call list so that she could continue to have access to them and a relationship with them while she was at the RTC. I also asked that some of her friends be listed on that, so to kind of maintain that normalcy for her. I was told that when youth are in RTCs, they generally like them to focus on their therapy and not on social relationships. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that, but I knew that that youth was not going to be there very long, so I didn't really push it too much. But if if your youth that you work with has a very important, best friend that they talk to every day, and that person is, an appropriate support for them, I would push back on that a little bit. Generally, the youth are allowed to make phone calls at designated times, like in the evening or the weekends. And I don't really see any reason why they shouldn't be allowed to do that, even once a week, just to check in with a friend, even though they're, focusing on their therapy. So it's just something to keep in mind and that you could advocate for if it's something that's important to your client. Again, just important for kids to still feel some sense of normalcy, even when they're at an RTC. The better ones are pretty good about this. Most of them have recreational facilities like a gym, pool, basketball court, baseball field, things like that. They often will do group activities, either on campus, like movie nights or barbecues, or sometimes off campus if youth have earned those types of privileges. A lot of RTCs operate on a level or a point system. So, when you first arrive, they're generally at the lowest level, and then as they progress in their treatment and maintain, good behaviors and so forth, they kind of move up the levels and earn more privileges, so they can progress to, off-campus visits and things like that. I know that you all are not allowed, I guess you're not allowed to drive the youth, but perhaps if the coordinator, if the youth is close enough where you can actually go visit in person, such as Kids Peace, which is not a bad drive at all. It's a beautiful campus. So I would encourage you to go there if you do have a youth place there. But if the coordinator goes with you or something like that, and the youth has off-campus privileges, it's just such a nice treat for them if you take them out to lunch or something like that. If they don't have off-campus privileges, you could even pick up McDonald's and bring it to them. It's just the little things that help them feel, again, normal, feel like somebody cares about them. And just means a lot. Independent living services we know that those are very important for our older youth. They tend to get some of that, from the RTC directly. They're usually required to keep their rooms clean, and sometimes they help, do chores around the cottages or whatever. For a long time, DFS was maintaining a position that they would not provide independent living workers when youth were placed out of state. But recently, our wonderful attorney, Jennifer Klein, pushed back on that in a case that she had before Judge Jones. And Judge Jones and Jen pushed back against DFS and said, there is nothing that relieves you of your obligation to provide independent living services to youth when they are placed out of state. And there are plenty of things that an IL worker can do with a youth over Zoom. I mean, I have some kids that are living in state and their workers meet with them over Zoom. So there's no reason that they can't do the same for a youth in an RTC. They can talk to them about budgeting and come up with a budget together. They can talk to them about housing options after they turn 18 and, help them start completing forms that are online. There's all kinds of things they can do over Zoom, even when a youth is placed out of state. And when youth are getting near the age of 18, there is a financial literacy course that they have to take online in order to be eligible for assist funds after they turn 18. And so that's something but my understanding is that they cannot take that course unless they have been, unless they're open with the independent living program. So again, it's very important to advocate that that your youth, if they're 16 or older at an RTC, be referred to the independent living service or independent living program. If they haven't been already, if they're already open and have an IL worker, make sure that you are advocating that worker stay assigned to the youth and maintain contact with them so that they can get all that important stuff completed while they're there. Okay. Education. Usually education is on site, so it's included within the RTC. So they get their therapeutic treatment and they get their education all together, on the campus. You can, hopefully if you have a contact, if you have a good relationship with the therapist, you can ask them for the name, of the teacher or the director of the educational program. So if you want to get more frequent updates or check in on how the youth is doing. Typically, as I mentioned, education will be discussed in those monthly treatment team meetings if the RTC holds those. And I should have mentioned too, if they don't hold those or you're not, your youth has been there for a little while and they haven't had a treatment team meeting, then I would ask for one. You know, you can request that they have a team meeting to discuss, you know, updates on treatment and so forth. But at the good ones that hold those, education will be discussed. You'll hear, you know, how the youth is doing behaviorally in the classroom, you know, grade update, things like that. If the youth has an IEP, then the RTC should be implementing that IEP in their school. The homeschool does not change during this temporary residential placement. So it is not really the same, you know, as when you change placements in state. So you're not going to have a best interest meeting or anything like that. If the youth is in, you know, Capital School District attending Dover High School before they go to the RTC, then Capital School District remains responsible for, you know, for their special education services. And what will happen is if the youth needs an IEP meeting while they're in the RTC, then that school district should participate in that meeting as well. So teachers or, you know, the special ed coordinator or whatever from Capital School District should be part of the IEP meeting that occurs with the RTC staff as well. There is a specific staff person at the department who is the educational diagnostician for out-of-state placements. So it's her job to sort of keep tabs on youth that are in or out-of-state placements and when they need to have IEP reviews and things like that. Currently, that person is Angela Gonzon, and I've included her contact information here. So if you have a youth that's in an RTC and you know that they have an IEP review coming up, or you know, their triennial evaluation is coming up, something like that, you can either reach out to Angela or, like I said, the school district responsible for the child. You could reach out to their special education coordinator as well and say, hey, you know, this kid's due for an IEP review. Have you been in touch with the RTC? What are we doing to get this scheduled? Angela's great. I've worked with her a couple of times. So if you have questions, then I would just reach out to her and I'm sure that she will be able to help you. I had a youth that had to have their triennial review while at an RTC, and it took a little bit of coordinating to make sure that that happened, but in the end, it was able to happen, and it worked out well. So they're pretty good at staying on top of that. Okay, and discharge planning. So discharge planning should really start from day one. So once the youth gets their treatment plan and finds out what their treatment goals are, that's sort of their path to discharge. That's, you know, how they know what they need to do in order to successfully complete the program and be discharged. And then, you know, every time you have those treatment team meetings, you know, and you're discussing progress and how they're doing, you should also be talking about discharge planning. Typically, they will give you a discharge date, you know, from day one. You know, they'll say the target discharge date is, like I said, maybe 90 days out from placement, and then that should be reviewed every month at those meetings. So the youth is making progress, we're going to keep the same discharge date, or, you know, the youth has had a really rough month and went backwards, and, you know, we think that maybe we're going to have to you know, project the discharge date out another month or whatever, but it should be constantly discussed. And also what should be discussed at all of those meetings is, you know, okay, we're 2 months out from discharge, you know, what is the plan? Where is this youth going? What services are going to be in place when they get there? Hopefully PBH will be part of those treatment team meetings. In my experience, the PBH workers are a lot better at attending those meetings than the DFS workers. So, you know, they generally have a good handle on what the youth's needs are going to be, but the RTC will usually make recommendations. You know, we think that this youth is going to need this level of care, you know, when they leave here. Sometimes it may be a step down to day treatment, which is where the youth will attend a program, maybe like Dover Behavioral Health during the day, and then they'll go home to a foster home or group home at night and on the weekends. So that's a very sort of intensive step down from an RTC if the youth needs a little more support before going fully back into the community. I don't see that as much when my youth leave RTCs. I tend to see day treatment more when they leave those inpatient psychiatric facilities, but it is an option. Most of the time, the youth will get mobile outpatient and TSF support. So, so those more intensive, more hours of services of mental health support than typical outpatient. And they'll have that for a while after coming out of the RTC. Another piece you want to make sure is in place is the medication management if the youth is on any psychiatric medications or prescribed medications, because they'll usually be discharged with maybe like a 30-day supply from the RTC. So you need to make sure that they're able to get in to see a provider shortly after their discharge to ensure that there's no break or lapse in their medication. And then obviously you need to determine a placement. If the youth has disrupted their foster placement prior to going to the RTC, they may not be able to return there. DFS should be looking to figure out where they're going to place the youth upon discharge. This can be tricky because a lot of times DFS will say, and rightfully so, that they can't start looking too early, because if they identify a placement, long before the youth is ready for discharge, they can't hold that placement forever. So this does kind of become a balancing act of starting to look, prior to discharge, but not too far prior to discharge. There is a little room for advocacy here because I had a youth, again, the one that was at the Hughes Center. The whole time she was there was a lot of emphasis on transition. She has a really hard time with transitions. Her therapist kept saying any placement, that she goes to from here, we need to have a very good transition plan. She's going to need to meet the caregivers beforehand and, this and that. So the time came for her to be discharged and she was going to go to Seaford House, and DFS basically said she is going, it was like a Friday afternoon right before, I think, the 4th of July. And they wanted her to go there like the following Wednesday. And so it was a holiday weekend. And her therapist was like, I'm on vacation next week. I'm not even going to be here to help her process this and transition. So we pushed back, and Seaford House was saying, well, we can't hold this bed. We've got other youth that can take this bed. We can't hold it. What it came down to really was a payment issue, right? So DFS didn't want to pay for a bed that this youth wasn't using while they were still also paying for her to be at the RTC, because PBH had stopped paying because she had been ready for discharge for a while. So I was able to advocate and get DFS to pay for to hold that placement for about 2 weeks so that she could have a good transition plan before going there. So if you have a situation like that come up, reach out to the coordinator so that we can, they can talk to admin here and figure out a good way to help with that. And then also, where is their school placement going to be? There is a chance that the school may say they want them, the youth, to go to an alternative placement for a little while before returning to the general school. I don't see that happen very frequently, but there is a chance that could happen. So the takeaways from today is that the therapist will be your best friend if you can find out who that person is and have a relationship with them. It just makes life so much easier. I check in with my youth therapists all the time, in between hearings, in between treatment team meetings, find out if there's anything that they need, any bath products, things like that. It's great. They're a great contact most of the time. Maintaining regular contact with the child is so important for their for their self-esteem and their normalcy, and for you to be able to do your job to advocate for them in person whenever possible. And as always, if you encounter any issues, barriers, you can always reach out to your coordinator or the child attorney to help you navigate those. So have just a few more minutes left for discussion or questions. Thank you all.
Yeah, Molly, thank you for doing this. If you want to stop sharing your screen, maybe we can, I can see if anybody has questions.
Here we go.
Awesome, thanks. How many of you have, just a raise hands of how many have experience working with a child at an RTC? No? Okay, Jeanette. Okay, Julie. A couple. Okay. Yeah, awesome. So do we have any questions or anything? No? Molly, you did such a great job.
Excellent. I answered every question.
You answered every question, and it's so confusing. I find it confusing sometimes to know the difference between an RTC, congregate care, psychiatric, and kind of what does that mean. But I feel like just my experience with all of them is that we're still a team, and as CASAs, we advocate for their needs. And I love what you said about discharge starts on day one. Where it's sort of like when kids come into state custody, our plan is not to keep them here. So what is our permanency plan? And we're looking at that from day one. So awesome. All right. Well, if nobody has any other questions, we'll wrap this up. Thank you all so much. You get an hour of your in-service training. And Molly, thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Bye. Thank you all.
Bye.